Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us again for our third training session for today. We're going to have a total of 8, so that puts us about 25% of the way through the training that you guys are going to get. So the next up is Nick Eimers, another Nick. I like to keep them back to back. And Nick is also a chemical engineer, and he came out of the University of Idaho, as I did, and Ron Baldus did, and Mike Myers, and Alex Tate, and we found out there was a good fit for us. A lot of good engineers that came out of there that have worked for Capstone. And Nick will be doing a presentation on alarms and PARCtask. So always traditionally, alarm server can trigger emails, but we're adding in the latest version 7.1 the ability where the alarm server can trigger PARCtask workflows. So extending the ability of what the alarm server can do post-alarm event, maybe after the start alarm or the end alarm. And Nick will dig into that. And it is a feature that is available now in 7, and he'll go into how to configure and possibly some of the use cases that we can do with that. So now I'm going to hand it over to Nick, and he'll go over PARCtask workflow triggered from alarms. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So once again, my name is Nick Eimers, and I work for Capstone Technology. I'm an engineer here with the engineering group, and I'm going to basically be going over a new feature with PARCtask and PARCalarm that's come out in 7.1. Really, the integration of the two is the new feature. So we'll be talking a little bit about why we wanted to do that, why it's useful, as well as how to use it in your own setup. So this is a little bit of a more difficult training session to do because there are a few, these are parts of PARCview that I know that not everyone is going to be overly familiar with, especially PARCtask. So just to start with, to try and get everyone on the same page, I want to spend a little bit of time going over what both of these parts of PARCview kind of originally did, what their base functionality is relative to versions 5, 6, and below. So we're kind of all on the same page. So PARCalarm, I'm a little, I feel more people are aware of what PARCalarm is all about. This is it's maybe more of a power user than a basic user bit of the software. But I think there's a lot of general knowledge about PARCalarm. So PARCalarm, you're typically setting it to watch a given tag or tags for some sort of criteria, often abrupt process changes or exceeding SQC or SQL limit, SQC or SPC limits, sudden rate changes, things of that nature. And when it detects those changes, it records information about that in the database so that you can do things like downtime entry. And it also shows up on trends and center lines and things like that. With trends, you can then do downtime acknowledgement. So we're using a lot of reporting especially for tracking deviations and things like that. So that's configured in PARCalarm or configured in PARCconfig right out of PARCview. PARCtask, I think, is probably a little less well known. PARCtask is for basically scheduling things, what we would call workflows, and it has a server-side component that basically executes the logic that you tell it, and then it has a client-side component where you can configure that logic that you want to run either as a kind of a once-off thing, or more often on like a schedule, daily, weekly, or whatever, monthly, hourly. And some of we'll go over some of what it can do, but things like rendering trends and graphics as images and emailing them out. And it's definitely, whereas PARCalarm is perhaps kind of a power user type setting or type feature, PARCtask is a little more advanced. I would say it's definitely well into the super user category, where there's typically not a lot of people at a given site that are kind of in the PARCtask configuration and kind of tinkering with it. So I think a lot of this presentation is going to be more talking about really just some of the basics of PARCtask. I'm kind of going to assume that people have a little more familiarity with PARCalarm. And we do have some webinars and things like that, especially for PARCalarm, that cover a lot of the basics. So if you're a little rusty on PARCalarm, it's not a big deal. But I will, for this training, I'm going to focus a little more on the PARCtask side, just because I think that's kind of the difficult part of it. So why would we want to integrate PARCtask and PARCalarm? And really, like, what does that even mean? So PARCalarm has been kind of a bit of a workhorse for us. It's a pretty old part of ParkView. It's been around for a really long time. PARCtask has been around for a while now too, but it's relatively new. I think PARCtask came out in like 5.3 or so. So it's been around for a couple of years for sure, but PARCalarm's been around forever. I believe it was here when I started like 8 years ago. So it's been around for quite a while. And we use it a lot of places for, like I said, for watching, SQC violations and things like that. It's pretty robust, but as far as kind of the dynamic notifications, it's a little weaker, basically. It can send, anyone who's used it is pretty aware they can send text messages and emails, although, well, it sends text messages via email, but basically it can send out, simple emails that indicate things like what tag, when to alarm, what the value is, a few other kind of miscellaneous things, but they're really meant to be very simple, pure text-based messages, nothing else. Can't really send anything fancy. And so, and then also, I mean, there's a way of sending links to displays, but these links are purely meant to be launched from the desktop client, essentially. You're sending a physical file path that someone, sitting at their Outlook client at their, in their desk would then be able to see the email come in and be like, oh, I've got a break alert on the paper machine, and they would click the link and launch up the trend that you had assigned with that alarm to look at it. But they need to have ParkView physically installed. The closest thing that you can really have to like a mobile viewable link is if you have Park Mobile installed for the site, and then you put, in your links associated with the alarm, you put URLs in those links. And this is still not like a perfect solution, just because you typically need to be on, you need to be on the mill network, plant network, whatever. Most sites do not have Park Mobile exposed off the VPN set up for the site off the network. So if you're sitting at home and you get the text with the link in it, you still probably won't be able to see it. And so this is a little bit where ParkTask comes in that it's a little bit more robust in what it can do, as far as, it has capability of rendering trends and graphics as images. It also has the ability to render Park reports as PDFs. And then it can send an email with an attachment. And of course, that attachment can be the PDF or the images that you rendered. It also has the ability to do custom VB.NET scripting. So if you're willing to spend enough time on it and you have, a good robust programming background, you can kind of cover any sort of custom request that you would kind of need. The problem really on the ParkTask side of this sort of thing, and we've been doing a little bit of light integration with ParkTask and ParkAlarm on kind of like a custom basis before this. But it was involved a lot of programming and setup, where we basically, right now, ParkTask, as far as schedules go, you can tell it to execute the logic that you configure for it on a fixed schedule, for instance, or based on watching a file or a folder change. So what we would kind of have to do if we wanted the sort of integration between the two, if we wanted to ParkTask to do something when an alarm activates, would be to kind of set it to run really quickly, like every 5 seconds, and kind of pull the database with a query to see if anything new had come in. And then if it did, then we'd run the rest of the logic. So it worked, but it was a little kludgy. And so now what we basically have done is, instead we just, we're like, well, we already have the ability in the alarm server to kick off, these texts and emails when it notes that an alarm has started, or an alarm has ended, or alarm's been going on for longer than is expected if you have a recurring notification set up. So it's really not that hard to then basically make ParkAlarm to give it the ability to also kick off a workflow. And so now we don't have to do any of that polling or anything like that. We just basically have set it up so that, on the user side in Park Alarm, you just indicate that if you would like, you just pick the workflow that you want to trigger and pass it some parameters perhaps, and then otherwise you just tell it, the moment the alarm activates, kick this workflow off, or 5 minutes after the alarm activates, kick the workflow off, whatever is required. And so here's just and I think probably 90%, I suspect, of what's going to happen with this feature is that people are just going to want basically trends or maybe graphics rendered when a alarm kicks off. There'll certainly be some other stuff that people will maybe want, like we're starting to integrate with some third parties a lot, like more and more using like web APIs and things like that, where we push alarm data or other things, information about machine states turning on and off, kind of up to the cloud dynamic, or as they happen, to give these third party data analytics companies more data, more real-time data that isn't really readily available to them. And that's where the VB.NET scripting will come in. And so that'll be useful for sure. But probably like your average user is going to want to set it up so that it, whenever an alarm activates, that it renders a trend, that shows the current data, and then it emails it off to the relevant party so that they can get that image and look at it on their mobile phone, regardless of whether, or their tablet or whatever, regardless of whether they're on the VPN or they're at the mill or not. And so there's just a quick one that I did using another. I'm not sure when exactly this feature made it in. It's definitely a 7.0 feature, if not a 7.1 feature. But I think it's it is kind of a snazzy new thing that we added, where if you have SQC limits enabled, you can now basically turn on and show the SQC zones. That's nominally the standard deviation zones. If you're using a target, and then outer limits that are 3 sigma away from the target. But in this case, you can see I basically just set up a simple alert where I have kind of some dummied up lab data here, and it's just really nice in this case because originally what I would have gotten from the alarm server would be something like the basis weight's current value is 29 and it's out of spec, and it's kind of up to me to then dig in a little bit more on whether that's a big deal or not. So, but now I can basically set it up to send me this trend, and I can look at the image, and I can see that in this case it looks like we went too high, and then it kind of maybe the controller adjusted or something, and now we've spun way out of control on the other low end, and it maybe is an issue that I need to dig into. But maybe if you're sitting at home and you saw this, you're like, well, it's correcting. It'll get, I don't need to look into it just yet. So it gives you a little bit more context, and really I think that's where PARCview is pretty powerful, is in just trying to give the data context so it's readily understandable. So here where we get to some of the requirements for using this feature, and like I said, Park Alarm, I'm not quite as worried about people. It's a little more a power user feature, but I think people are pretty comfortable with it. We did update it in 5.6, so I'm sure there's been some relearning that's had to happen with a new interface in 5.6, but mostly it's the same stuff, so I don't think it was probably too hard. But I do not think that PARCtask is particularly well known. It's definitely more super user stuff, so that's where we're going to spend a lot of time trying to train on this one, so people maybe get a little more exposure to it, a little more familiarity. Just do that step by step. And then, of course, like I kind of mentioned at the beginning of the video, this is a new feature in 7.1.0.0. And, the best laid plans of mice and men, we definitely thought 7.1 would be out by the user conference, but it does not appear to be. So so I can just, so no one will technically have, other than unless you've hacked into my development setup at PARCview, you probably won't have access to 7.1 to play around with for this video. So I can kind of already see my viewership. I can just picture my viewership count just plummeting after this slide. But bear with me. I will say some of the training that I'll do for PARCtask is relevant in basically any any setup that has PARCtask, which is like anything after 5.3. So most people will have that. And if you understand how PARCtask works, I think the Park Alarm side that's new will be very easy to configure. Whenever you do wind up with 7.1. So bear with me a little bit. Well, hopefully I'll still manage to make it useful for everyone. But I will say that if you're the mill manager or whatever watching this presentation, this is the part where I'm going to do the actual training and whatnot. And so we'll be getting a little bit more in the weeds now. So if you're not really like super interested in like the pure training part of things, this is where I'll get a little more technical. But for everyone else, let's do a little bit of actual configuration in PARCtask. So I've to avoid any potential gremlins, I've gone ahead and just pre-recorded this. We're broken into a couple parts. So we're going to start by just basically from scratch. We're going to make a workflow in PARCtask that renders a trend. We appreciate my background here on my desktop. So I'm just going to go to the start panel here, and I'm going to go ahead and open up the PARCtask workflow designer. So it is a client component. So if you installed ParkView on your machine, you should have the workflow designer unless you specifically didn't install it. I do have a few other things in here that you will not have because I have the full server installation as well running on the same machine. You don't need, don't worry about not having the UA server or anything like that, but you should have the workflow designer unless you didn't install it. If you don't have it, you can rerun the installer and I believe and add it in as well, or add it on top of your existing installation. So here's the workflow designer. You may or may not be familiar with it. I'm just going to go up and click File, and we're going to be doing a designer workflow, which is kind of like the simplest option. You can do script workflows, which are all code, and those might be convenient for someone if you're trying to do like custom integration with a third party, where just everything is in code. But that's a little beyond the scope of this training session, so we're not going to worry about those. As a heads up, you may have those not available. Maybe grayed out. If that's the case, it's just because you need to go to that options section down there and enable advanced workflows. It's a bit of a catch. But anyways, we're going to do a designer workflow, so we'll go ahead and make a new one. This window a little bigger. So the first thing that's probably a good thing to do is to rename your workflow to something a little less silly than designer workflow 1. This does need to be kind of like a programming name in the sense that it can't have any spaces or anything like that. So I'm going to give it kind of a silly name. I wouldn't call yours something like this, but make sure there's no spaces or anything. And then in the description, make sure that can have spaces and all that. And so you can you put whatever you want in there, and I would make that one a little bit more sensible. But and then. And I'm going to actually rehit this later, but just to make sure everyone, if you want your workflow to do anything, you have to make sure it is enabled. And then in this case, because we want it to show up in the alarm window, we also need to check off this Show in ParkView checkbox. And if you don't see this window when you're in yours, just make sure you click in the white space anywhere, not on like a trigger or a block, and you should be able to see that properties panel. But here, I'm just going to drag in real quick on from the triggers section. Triggers are executions, basically, like when it's going to happen. So I'm just going to drag in an execute once block. You don't actually have to do this, but it's easy. It makes it easier to test things. So basically, I do it. I do when I build all my workflows. I typically start with one execute once block, and I'm going to go over here and I'm going to uncheck is delete on expiration, because it's that'll kill this trigger once it's executed once, and that's generally not favorable for testing because I rarely get it right on the first try. And then just to get rid of this little red warning here, I'm going to give it a time. It doesn't really matter what time you give it, to be honest. I always just double click on the now button to fill it with now. It doesn't matter. You don't have to set it in the future or anything like that. If I get it now, I'm going to execute it in 5 minutes. It's just going to execute it immediately, thinking that PARCtask server will think it's a little late, but that's the only way. That's the only thing that matters. And so basically, the moment I go up to that File tab over there and hit Save, it's going to run this thing. But we won't worry about that for now. So instead, we're going to build out the logic here in this bottom section. So the top section is for triggers when it executes. The bottom section is for execute what logic you're going to execute. So I'm going to go ahead and just drag in the save display image block. So this is what you use to render a trend or a graphic as an image. And then make sure you're not, and then I'm going to drag in this send email block here. And so that obviously sends an email. So it's pretty much all the logic actually that we need as far as the blocks go. That's it's really not that bad as far as what we need there. Although we'll see there's a little more involved in the setting of the actual parameters and things like that for the workflow. But I broke that into my next video, so let's go ahead and start this second one here. So we need to basically give both of these guys parameters on like who do I send the email to, what file do I need to render, things like that. And so you can see as you click on either of the blocks, that little parameter section down below changes. But what I'm going to come up here and maybe I'll pause this for just a second to point it out, because I did it a little fast. I clicked the little green plus arrow here in this workflow parameter section. The reason why I did that is I want to basically pass a few dynamic parameters into my blocks. I don't want to like hard code necessarily that I don't want to render the same file potentially every time. I want to make this a little more generic so it'll work for the majority of trends that might get passed in. This just makes it easier for users that are using it later in PARCalarm to configure it, as we'll see in kind of like the next step after this. But Liz looking forward a little bit. So, oops, apparently I clicked. I clicked one of the buttons here, but anyways, we'll get back to the same section here in a bit. There we go. So yeah, so in this case, I'm just going to add a couple of parameters, and I'm going to change all the names. Things. So like I said, these are just going to be like what trend I want to render. Who's going to receive, or in this case, what the subject of the email is going to go out with the attachment, what to say for the body, which I'm just going to basically default to, see attached, and then what the distribution list is for the email. So now that I've got these parameters defined, these are generic parameters. They don't do anything on their own. I do have to point them at, or I have to tell the blocks to use what's in these. But before I do that, I'm going to come on each one of them and check off this ParcView overridable checkbox. That's just important because that makes it available for users in PARCalarm config to actually see these parameters. Otherwise, people won't be able to actually change them for the alarm configuration. So you don't necessarily need to do that for a regular workflow, but in this case, because we're doing it for PARCalarm, that's a little more important. And then last, I'm going to add one more variable that's actually not going to be, I'm not going to show it to the users because it is basically for me to pass information around between the blocks. So now I'm going to click on the Save Display Image block, and I'm going to come over here and change it from literal, which means a hard-coded value, basically a fixed value. I'm going to point it at parameter. And then I just have to pick which of my parameters I want to point it at. So we'll point at my trend display image path. So that's basically saying I want to use whatever gets passed into that particular parameter. That's the path. I basically want to take that and assume that that's the path to render for this block. I'm going to default that to a path on my, or in this case, I'm going to default the destination folder path, which is basically where things are going to get rendered to a fixed folder on my machine. That does need to be somewhere the server can see, by the way. So it's kind of important that that be a server path, not a local path on your machine. Then there's a bunch of other stuff in here that at least for this, I'm not going to change, like the size of the image and whether it's a PNG or not. But I am going to point this saved file path. You see it's a little bit different than, this parameter says out, whereas all the other ones say in. And so this basically is going to receive a value rather than reading in a value. It's going to write to this value rather than receiving it. And that's just to make it easier to pass into the attachments block of the send email block, essentially. So my save display image is going to write out a file, an image, and then it's going to basically in that trend image output path, it's going to automatically say what the path of that file is. So in the send email block, it's quite easy for me to attach it. Although before I get to that, I'm going to just do the same thing here. I'm just going to make all these subject, body, the addresses are going to be all parameters, and just feed them all my parameters that I already defined. And then the last one, is also a parameter, but this is my output parameter that I basically am writing to from my save display image block. And you can kind of see that here as I'm kind of indicating with the it says it kind of shows what blocks are being read from, and then if anything is being written to, it shows it underneath it. So the save display image, you can see it's read from trend display input path, and it writes to trend image output path. And so eventually, it's just going to basically write out something like this. But here, I'm going to basically fill in some of these values. These are like defaults, basically, is the way, or for our intents and purposes, these are going to be default values. I do have a mistake here that I forgot to correct for the video, but I have quotes around that file path. You should not have quotes in the file path. For my speed trend file, you can see I've got some quotes around that path. That will mess things up, unfortunately. So make sure you clip those out if you're following the video. But basically, I'm just filling these out, and then I'm coming up and clicking file save, and if everything is correct, it'll basically kick the workflow off and send it out. If you want to do some troubleshooting, you can click that server console window at the top, and it will show you if you have any errors, basically for a particular workflow, which is what I had to do to figure out that I had put those quotes in there by accident. But basically, these parameters here are kind of, like I said, these will be the defaults, and we can see that we don't actually have, we can use these if we want, but of course most users will override them to funnel something else through. So this basically, but this way we could kind of test our workflow using our execute once block to make sure that the logic on the PARCtask side is correct before we move on and kind of like wait for the alarm server to detect an alarm and send everything out to see if everything is working, because waiting for an alarm can be kind of tedious unless you're using like manual data or something. But just I just wanted to, before we move on to the Park alarm side of things, I just wanted to reiterate, make sure that you check off a few of these settings like show in Park View and enabled on the server, or you're not going to get anything at all. And that can be a little, these are easy to miss settings. People kind of get frustrated with them, I know. So just to reiterate, make sure that for the workflow, you make sure you have show in Park View checked off and you have it enabled on the server. And then before you head over to Park alarm config, like I said before, or like I said in the video, make sure that for every parameter you're hoping to expose to the users, make sure you check off that Park View overridable prompt. And I don't show it in here, that Park View overridable checkbox, sorry. But there's also directly below it, there's a Park View prompt. It is actually good to fill that out. That's sort of the name that they'll see in Park alarm config. So if you want to give it a more descriptive name, whereas the names of the parameters are basically variables, so you want to kind of name them like, no spaces, kind of concise if possible. But you can use that Park View prompt field to give it a much more meaningful name to the users on the other side, which I have done. I just don't show it in this video or this screenshot. So bear that in mind if you're setting these workflows up for consumption by other people besides yourself that might not know what your cryptic variable naming scheme means. And then, so the last side of the video will be a little bit on the shorter end, but this is basically just going into Park alarm config, which you can see here. It's on the Tools tab, and it's on this alarms configuration. There's alarms list displays on the displays tab, which is something that's actually a view basically to alarms. So make sure you're on the Tools tab, and you're looking at alarm configuration. So we'll go ahead and open it up here. And I am kind of assuming that you already have an alarm configured that you want to use this for. I'm not going to go through alarm configuration because I only have so much time for my presentation. But it works for any alarm. I'm using an SQC type in this case. but it'll work for any alarm type. Doesn't matter what it is. Just so basically just configure your alarm however you normally would. And like I said, there's a webinar if you're a little rusty on that part that covers all of the basics of that. In 7.1, you'll notice that there's a new tab though called PARCtask Workflow, which is not in the webinar. So that's what this one is for. You'll see it's very similar to the notification tab though. So if you're familiar with the way the notifications tab works in 5.6, this will be exactly this is basically be very similar to you, or very familiar. Just as the notifications tab allows you to define what's called a template, which is basically a little bit of a strange name for it, but essentially it is a particular type of render or a particular type of notification. Might be sending particular information to a particular group. I might be emailing particular information to the operators that the machine is down, or might be emailing specific information to the engineering group that says like the machine is down and this was the grade and this is the some supporting information like speed. Whereas the PARCtask workflow section is exactly the same way. You'll still define a template, except now the template really represents more what workflow you want to choose and who you're sending it to, and the combination of parameters you're passing in. So I only have one workflow exposed in the system, and like I said, you're not going to see anything in the list unless you have that show in part view checkbox shown off. So I could have 20 workflows defined, but I don't have that checkbox checked off. You won't see any of them here, so be careful about that. In this case, I've got my one workflow, and as if I select it, you see that the parameters that I exposed in the server or in the workflow on this side are available for now for me to basically set values on. You see the value type has a couple of options. So default is basically going to be whatever I left in that box when I was defining the workflow. So you can see here in this one, email subject is see attached display. So that's going to be kind of like the default, essentially, what the default value is. If that box over there is blank, then you're not going to get anything. Value is basically just a literal value. So it's whatever you want it to be. Basically, you can override it to be this particular value. And this is what you're probably going to do for most cases, because in this case, you're probably going to want to say what trend file you want to specifically use. But to point it out, there is also alarm data as an option. So it's based on what parameter type you have, whether it's a string or a numeric. You can also pass in some information about the alarm itself. So that's kind of cool. And so you could basically make, like in my case, I could make the subject like the name of the alarm. Might make sense, but in this case, I'm going to just do PM1 speed alarm. Yeah, kind of boring, but so I'm going to make all of mine hard coded. But just so you know, you can pass in basically information from the alarm, which is especially useful if you're trying to do some sort of integration work with third-party applications and stuff like that, or if you're trying to pass information to like a generic PARC report that you might be writing, that handles alarm data. And a little bit painful. Slow this down just a little bit. You do have to kind of per PARCtask standards, and now kind of our alarm config for emails used to work that if you're passing in an email list, you do have to make sure it's a semicolon delimited list. So if you were adding more than one person, basically needs to be email address number 1, semicolon, email address number 2, so on and so forth. And then the last step, last thing you need to do is basically just choose when you want it to execute. So, most people are going to want it to trigger when the alarm is, initially detected. In this case, I put a little bit of a delay, like 1 minute, just to give a little bit more context. Maybe someone has time to put in, probably have 1 minute. It's probably not time for someone to put a reason code in, which you never know. And then, I'm just going to hit save up at the top, and it's pretty much ready to go. So you can see the PARC alarm side of things is pretty straightforward if you've set the PARCtask side up correctly. And just to point it out, so, I think checking off when the alarm is detected is probably going to be the most common one. Just like an email, you can set kind of a repeating execution. So if you set that repeat interval down at the bottom, you can basically have it, every hour, for instance, that the alarm is still active, you can have it email out. And then last, you can have it execute when the alarm has ended as well. So, basically here's for anyone who gets a hold of this presentation after the fact, who wants to kind of like slow down and look at this, here's just a final screenshot with some helpful tips about how to configure the park alarm side of things. So we successfully integrated PARCtask and park alarm. So just to wrap up, basically, if you just need to send out like a really simple text alert or something like that, park alarm will do that, and that's fine. But if you want to do something a little bit more involved, you're probably going to need the PARCtask integration, unless you want to get kind of custom. And you do need, like I said, you need 7.1 or higher to use it. So it might take most of our customers a little while to upgrade to that level, but once you get there, I think this is a pretty useful feature. And lastly, for the user conference goers, I do have a handout that should come with this presentation. I'm not quite sure in what fashion, but it has an XML file in it with instructions on how to use it that'll basically set up the workflow that I show in my demonstration here, with a few extra settings and things like that tweaked to be a little more user-friendly. So it'll get you going on the PARCtask side a little bit quicker, I think, having that example. So that is my presentation. Thanks for sitting through the entire thing. And yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to send them in the chat or shout them out, and hopefully someone will get them to you, or pass them to me.
Okay, well, thank you, Nick. And I think we're ready for some Q&A, and hopefully people learn a little bit more about PARCtask than maybe they knew or remembered, and look forward to using it with the alarm server as well. So we have one of the questions was, somebody asked, they wonder if this new feature has any constraints to be implemented where there's a multi-site configuration. Any constraints that you can imagine around a multi kind of corporate site?
I guess it depends on what the main concerns are, but usually you have one PARCtask server set up per database, I believe. I don't think we've yet made it so it's you can have kind of multiple sites running with the same instance of PARCtask. So I guess the main things I would be cautious with are that PARCtask does let you essentially execute logic on the server. So especially for like a multi-corporate or multi-site setup, I would make sure that you have security implemented such that just like ParkView, you can configure security settings for PARCtask. Who can launch the workflow designer I think is the main one. I don't know if it actually gets much more granular than that, but it's really most of what you need. So I would I'd make sure that you have for each individual site that you have those permissions configured so that X person can only get into the PARCtask setup for the sites that they're supposed to be into, and of course since those workflows can be kind of complicated, I would make sure that you maybe block people that you don't necessarily want getting in there and tinkering with stuff. But as far as like constraints, as far as like architecturally speaking, I think you do need one PARCtask server per database, essentially per CDP config database. But beyond that, I don't believe there should be. I think I would, as long as you have the site, your site settings such that you can read tag data or whatever from all the other sites or whatnot, it should be able to do the same things that ParkView can do as far as site-to-site connections.
And then one thing to remember too about PARCtask is, so if you did multiple sites and you wanted to build a common workflow that takes in an email and a display and will render that and email it out, with PARCtask you can export a workflow and then import it again. So you may have to kind of manually make sure you put that in each site and etc. But PARCtask is basically running like a client. So if you have other locations that are getting tag data in your main location, if it renders a trend that has tags from remote locations, those should all show up. But as long as the client can see it, PARCtask should be able to get that data too. So then we had some questions about concatenating multiple alarm data fields together. So for instance, if you wanted, example is if you wanted to customize that subject, have a generic workflow, and you wanted to customize that subject to be like the tag and start and end time and maybe a value or something like that, can you concatenate them? And would you do that concatenation in the configuration in the alarm, or would you have to do the concatenation in basically your workflow?
Yeah, and maybe if I'm wrong, but I don't believe you can do it on the configuration side. I do believe you'd have to do it on the PARCtask side, but it should be fairly simple. In PARCtask, there is a script block. It's one of the logic blocks of the script. And so all those parameters essentially, and maybe I'm not sure if I made it perfectly clear not in my explanations, but those, in a way, they sort of act like global variables. And so you can pass them in and out of blocks. And also in the script block, you can basically just, if you paste them in, you can use them like they're a variable that exists in that scope. So if you want to concatenate those variables together, what I would probably do is I would make a new parameter that I don't expose to the ParcView side of things. It would basically just be an internal workflow parameter. And then in a script block, I would just set that parameter's value equal to however many of the input parameters you're taking from the user for the alarm data. And then just, parameter equals parameter 1 plus parameter 2 plus parameter 3 or whatever. Just build the subject line you want and then pass that into the send email block the same way that I was doing with the hard-coded one. So it's a little more work, but it can definitely be done.
Okay, so it's send the 3 parameters to the workflow, concatenate them together into one subject. Maybe also build them into the body with more words.
Yeah, yep.
Render it and then send it off.
Yep, yeah, exactly. You could also send it to the body the same way. You use the same script block if you needed. You could just 2 lines. Depends on how complicated you want to make the concatenation, but you can make it pretty complicated message if you wanted to.
So it looks like some people are saying that they couldn't access the XML in the current handout, so we'll find a different way to get that.
Oh, you know what? Yeah, I probably did mess that up. I think I embedded it. I embedded it in a Word document, but if it got PDF, I bet it's probably not accessible. So that's my fault. Sorry about that.
So we'll get that up and either send out a link or zip together a few things and send it out to you guys to get those to you. Now, somebody asked a question is for like complex workflow tasks. We do have a log or some bug debugging, except in the PARCtask server for them to maybe troubleshoot what may be tripped up. Correct?
Is it basically the question is it there?
Yeah. Is you build it, alarms triggered, nothing goes out. What would be kind of your steps to go in and figure out what maybe went wrong?
I think there was actually just a forum post about this. I think Katie actually posted one real recently. But if you always get a little confused, you go check that. But essentially the gist of the forum post is that there's I showed it real briefly. I think in the where I mentioned it real briefly in the presentation. But there's a button in the ribbon of the workflow designer that says Server Console. And so if you click the Server Console, it'll bring up a new window that's basically a view at the server side end of it. And I've seen a little bit where sometimes, like if you're on a client and there can be some firewall issues, or maybe it doesn't talk to the service that well. So I'll say that sometimes you might have to hop on the server to really troubleshoot. But a lot of times, you can just right from the client, you can see basically what's happening with the server side. And then it basically shows you a list, a grid of all the workflows that are currently active or inactive on the server. And you just click the one that you want to look and see what errors have happened on. And then I think this part is a little bit tricky because once you click that one, there's another section below it that lists the executions or the triggers for that workflow. And so you basically pick the workflow, just click on it. And then you have to pick a specific trigger that you want to look at the executions for that trigger. So, if it was a recurring execution trigger rather than alarm trigger, for instance, I would click the, time schedule trigger 1 or whatever it is. And then once you click the trigger, it'll show a list of executions that trigger has kicked off. And you can see for each individual one if there are any errors for it. If there are, you basically just double click on the box that says errors, and it'll pop open a little message box that shows the full detailed error. And usually from there, some of them are pretty self-explanatory, like file not found. And like I mentioned, this is something that's executing on the server. And so a common problem I see is that people paste it in like a path to their desktop, for instance. And, as powerful as the data part server is, it usually can't get to your desktop. It's got to be, so at that point, I pasted in a local path. I need to go get a server path and use the UNC path to the share or something like that instead. Sometimes the errors are a little more cryptic, and then usually I don't immediately understand what they mean. I'll paste it into Google. A lot of those errors are pretty standard. And if that fails, then of course there's always support.
So I think we have time for one more question. Somebody is saying that they have version 5.6 and they are using some workflows already. Now, the example that you're going to provide, I know we couldn't have the alarm server trigger it, but is it a workflow that they could use or take a look at in their 5.6?
I think I tested it imported into my 5.6. I think I tested it in 5.6.3 as well, and I believe it did work. So I believe it would work in 5.6 as well as 7. Yeah.
Yeah, so we just wouldn't have the alarm server triggering it, but they could fill in a email, a subject, a path, and whatnot, and do a reoccurring one, and it would shoot off a trend or a graphic on a schedule.
Yep. Yeah, and that's one thing. So hopefully people weren't bored by the PARCtask training, but like the PARCtask side actually is quite literally unchanged from 5.6. So all that stuff is applicable to 5.6. That show in ParkView function also basically makes it available if. Something probably people don't notice too often, but if you're in a trend, there's a schedule button in the trend that has the PARCtask icon on it, and you can basically, if a workflow has been marked as show in ParkView, you can basically choose to schedule the workflow or to pick a workflow to execute from the trend. So checking that off actually does something in 5.6 as well. A little harder maybe to configure. I think they did a little bit better job in Park Alarm making it friendly, but you can kind of do the same thing for a trend for a time schedule execution in 5.6 if you wanted to try that. And I think that would work with this workflow fairly well.
I would think so from what I saw about it. It's still usable in 5.6, and then when you go to 7, you just jump into your alarm server and start configuring things. Okay, I think that's all the questions. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.
Thanks for putting that all together and joining us for questions. So next we have another N, Neil McGee, another 4-letter N name. And he's going to go over the ParkView deviation detection tool that you may have seen before and dig into it more of a how do I use it, how do I set it up type scenario. So please come back in about 2 minutes and join us for that. Thank you.